Right, afternoon everyone. Hopefully you've now got my screen. As you'll know if you're here, this is the first in a series of webinars that we're doing to try and just bring more colour to what we're doing within the building so that you've got more of an idea of what it is that we do. I'm Mr. Woolley and I'm going to talk you through how things operate in terms of teaching and learning. There's obviously a questioning function as well, so please do make sure that you drop your questions in and I'll try and answer them as I go through if they do pop up for me. In terms of starting with this, it's worth us starting with thinking about what we're actually trying to achieve in terms of learning, and we base it all around this model, which I'm going to talk quite a lot about tonight. But our key aim really is making sure that we change long-term memory. Okay, so if I've got three questions on the side there. One is, what's 5 times 10? The next is, I run to the shops. Is that a verb or a noun? And the third is, H2O, what's that the chemical formula for? Now, I would anticipate that probably for each of those, they were right there for you, and that you would be able to pull those straight down from your long-term memory. You didn't really have to think a lot at all. Our aim is to make sure that for all of the things that we're teaching our students, whether it's knowledge or whether it's the skills that we want them to do, that those things are absolutely at their fingertips, partly because we know that that's what they need in terms of their exams and to get the outcomes that we want them to get, but also because we want them to go on and know those things and be able to do those things for the rest of their lives, because we know that they're the things that are going to help them to get successful. However, in terms of this model, there's obviously 1, 2, 3, and 4 on there. There are 4 different stages of kind of learning that we think about, or we could think about them as 4 different barriers. And we base a lot of what we do around trying to make sure that everything that we do within classrooms tries to get around those barriers so that we maximize the extent to which we're getting what we want to get into long-term memory there so our students know it. In this session, I'm going to talk about each of those barriers. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the barrier is, and I'm going to talk a bit about what we do to get around those things. So hopefully you'll have a much better idea by the end of the session. So the first barrier is a really, really straightforward one, and you can see it quite clearly in this diagram. So obviously, in order to learn anything, in order to actually be able to remember anything, we have to be paying attention to it in the first place. That's not the same thing as just being in the same room as a teacher talking about something, but we have to pay that active attention to it. And as we see from the diagram as well, often there are lots of things going on in the environment that we might be in. And when that's the case, it's quite difficult to focus on an individual thing and pay attention to an individual thing that we need to learn. Some of the key things that we do are quite straightforward and obvious around ensuring that students are paying attention. And the first is the most important one in our endeavour to make sure that we're teaching engaging lessons where it is easy to pay attention to those. That's partly through hooking people in through interesting things, but it's also ensuring that we go at a lively pace. Second on there, minimising distractions is a really important one. One of those things is making sure that there's a reasonably quiet and calm room throughout lessons so that it's easy to think and not get distracted, and that people aren't talking about things within lessons that potentially they shouldn't be because they're distracted. But it's also about doing things like making sure, like this slide, for instance, that I've got on, there aren't too many things on it. It's not too busy. There's not too much text, because that can also become distracting if there's irrelevant things on there. So we try and make sure that that's the case. And finally, it's about redirecting attention. We're all aware of the fact that whoever we are, we're going to drift off at some point. We appreciate that that's going to be the case for students in lessons, and it's about us redirecting attention and making sure we're noticing that and cueing students back in. Those are 3 key things that we do around making sure that we secure that attention. The second barrier is a slightly more interesting one and a slightly more difficult one in some ways, and this is around the second bit that I've got here, which is working memory. I've obviously got working memory, and then we've got long-term memory. As I demonstrated to you at the start, long-term memory are the things that we just know, that are there for us. They're stored there and they're forever, and we can pull them down forever. Working memory is a little bit different. And working memory, to think about working memory, it's worth thinking about that time that you've been on the phone when somebody's saying a phone number to you that you need to remember, but you haven't got a pen to write it down. And very quickly, you start to feel overwhelmed. And I'll go a bit further with that. So if I was to ask you within the next 20 or 30 seconds, to have a quick think about whether you can memorize all of those and memorize as many as you can. If I then click on and you try and think about how many of you can then pull back, what we would tend to find is that most people will be about there, give or take a few here and there, particularly if we're quite good at chunking information. So if we combine some of those letters and numbers together, we might well remember some more, and some people have more ability to do those things. But that's about where we would expect to be, because we can only hold that amount of new information in our heads at any one time. Now, that makes some things about learning really, really difficult. And we appreciate that, and there are many things that we do to try and get around that. But here are some examples. And all of these are taken from what we would expect students in year 7, 8, and 9 to do, and some of them from year 7. And some of them are really tricky. So that first one I've got, write 2 point evidence explanation paragraphs explaining 2 reasons why William the Conqueror defeated Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings. And then I've got 2 learners. Now, in terms of working memory, there's an awful lot for our students to hold on to in one thing there. We've got to know what a point is, we've got to know what evidence is, what an explanation is, how all of those things link. But not only that, we've also got to understand all of the things about the Battle of Hastings, William the Conqueror, and Harold all at the same time and hang on to those things together, which is really tricky. Let's take, for instance, let's say that Jenny here has actually learned really well to write point evidence explanation paragraphs so that they're in her long-term memory. In that instance, Jenny only actually has to hold on to the history details that we're talking about here, okay, the historical facts. And therefore she's at a significant advantage, and she's unlikely to be overwhelmed. But if we take Jimmy, who potentially hasn't encoded and learned to do point evidence explanation paragraphs, he's got to hold on to the entire thing. And very quickly, he's going to be overwhelmed in terms of working memory. It's going to be very, very difficult for him to learn. And we'll talk about some things that we do to make sure that we get around that barrier. But it's just the same in other subjects. So for instance, follow the recipe and use the techniques they've shown you to make your own scones. There's a lot to hold on to there. We've got to hold on to the recipe, we've got to hold on to the techniques we've been shown, and think about the end product, and equally with a maths problem at the bottom there. It's quite a tricky one, and actually there's an awful lot in it. If we've got prior knowledge on it, it's much more straightforward. If we haven't, then it's challenging, and some of us might be looking at that in particular and thinking, do you know what, actually, because I haven't done that for a long time, that would be really challenging for me, and I'd really, really struggle with that. So what do we do about that then? What do we do to ensure that our students aren't overwhelmed in terms of their working memory and make sure that we can learn things? The first thing to talk about is this. So one thing that could potentially be done is the setting of students different tasks. So for instance, we've just talked about Jimmy maybe not having developed his writing quite as well, and therefore we could set some tasks that are more straightforward. So within this example that I've got for you, everybody's looking at the Nepal earthquake in geography, but actually here, Jimmy's describing the responses to the Nepal earthquake, whereas Jenny is making judgments, so evaluating the immediate and long-term responses to the Nepal earthquake, the things that are done in order to try and make that situation better. The issue with that is that actually we want Jimmy to be able to do all of those brilliant things that Jenny's doing. We want him to be able to make all of those judgments. We want him to be able to look at the information in that way. So actually setting tasks that are much easier like that doesn't actually help Jimmy. And what we would want to do is actually, instead of setting different tasks, which increase the gap between those two, because Jenny's practicing much higher order skills and Jimmy's practicing much lower order skills, we would want to instead do something much more like that. So what we talk about when we're talking about this is adaptive teaching, which is essentially the idea that we pitch the learning high for everybody. There's ambitious learning goals for everybody, which are common. So everybody here is going to make judgments, is going to evaluate the immediate and long-term responses in the Nepal earthquake. However, we're going to teach our lesson in such a way that Jimmy actually is able to access that and do that really meaningful learning, but also have extensions there so that we can stretch Jenny further if she gets to a point where she can be stretched further. And there we've got something that's going to take that thinking much further. Down here, I've got 3 things that we would do to ensure that that's taking place. The first is the idea of chunking lessons, and I'll talk about that a little bit right now. So if I go on to this is our big picture slide, and this is often where our lessons start. We've got the big idea here. Is taken from a history lesson, so how effective, this is taken from the geography lesson again, how effectively the different countries respond to earthquakes, the same lesson that I've just been talking about. Instead of dealing with that big task all at once, which is this one, we break it down into small manageable chunks. So the first chunk, can I decide if responses are immediate or long-term? We make sure that we've dealt with that first and everybody understands that before we move on. Second, based on impact, so based on the things we look at, can we give some scores out of 10 for how effective we think those responses are? So we chunk that judgment and look at something one thing at a time so that we're thinking about one thing at a time. Only then, when we've done all of that and we've gone a chunk at a time, do we get to the big bit at the end where we're then evaluating and making judgments on the immediate and long-term responses. But it's one of the really important ways that we make sure that we don't overwhelm working memory, and that our students could all make progress. The second one there is modelling. We do a lot of work and have done a lot of work around the idea of I do, we do, you do. So when we get onto these extended tasks, particularly around writing, but around lots of other things, so for instance, making scones, we work hard on our modelling. In terms of the I do phase, that would be about the teacher showing very clearly how that process is completed, if that's writing a paragraph or if it's potentially making scones, showing very clearly how we complete that process, but also narrating what we do, so talking through what we're doing at the same time, so our students can hear the things that we're thinking at the same time, so they understand how we kind of construct that process, and they're taken inside of our brains on that. We might give them the chance to do a little bit together, write a paragraph together, or it might be that we bring them in and they get them to help us complete an example, if it's a paragraph or whatever it might be, so that we get to build that confidence. And finally, we get to you do, where actually they apply that independently, and they're much more prepared to do that at that stage. So that's the second thing we would do. Third thing that's really worth talking about, which is really important, is scaffolding. We might still be at a stage, particularly in this example, if Jimmy's not particularly confident in his writing, that actually, even with it chunking and even with some modelling, if he's having to hold on to a point, evidence, explanation on top of everything else, on top of all the things that he needs to know in terms of the subject content, that we risk him being overwhelmed in terms of your working memory. So we might make the decision there to give some scaffolding. So for instance, here, the scaffolding that helps Jimmy access that task might be a little writing frame. So it might be that we give him that point, evidence, explanation, writing frame, some sentence starters to get him going, to make sure he can then make the progress that we want him to do. We would then all obviously be looking to take that away over time, because we want Jimmy to be independent in those things. So those are a few of the things that we do around barrier 2. Barrier 3 is a really, really interesting one. And barrier 3 is all about the idea that we only actually take things into our long-term memory. So across this arm here, we only actually put things into our long-term memory if we think quite hard about them. And I'll try and prove that point to you. There's 50p. Now, I think we might get a reasonable hit rate with this. We didn't get that many with the students, but they don't use coins that much. But the first question I'll say is, what's on that coin? And it might well be that we struggle somewhat with that. Many of us might know that it's Britannia, but actually if we take that a step further and we say, okay, well, we've all seen that 50p with Britannia on thousands of times, we should know exactly what it's like. So what's in her left hand, what's in her right hand, what's on the shield, and what's at her feet, hopefully without reaching into your purse or wallet and getting a 50p. Now, there are the answers, but for the vast majority of us, without those answers being revealed, it might be a bit of a penny drop moment, for want of a better phrase. But lots of us wouldn't get those answers until they're actually revealed to us. And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is that it's actually just not something that we've ever sat down and thought particularly deeply about, because why would we? Why would we be thinking about those things? But what it shows us very clearly is, even if we come across things again and again and again and again, thousands of times, if we don't actually apply some significant thought to things, we just don't remember them. And that's obviously got really significant implications for what we do here. So what we try to ensure we do, obviously we break lessons down into chunks, but we try and make sure that throughout lessons, whatever new chunk of information that we're introducing, we're making our students think really hard about it, so that they have a much better chance of attaching that to their long-term memory, making them think hard about how it connects to what they already know on the subject, because that's how we build memories over time. One of the key things that we do around this is what we call over to me, which is a period in our lesson where we hand over to students and get them to think hard about something that we want them to do. So it might be writing paragraphs, it might be that they're doing some scone making independently, to use those examples that we've already used, or they might be solving a set of quite complex maths problems. But the point is that we want them to do those things on their own. And part of that is because we know that they need to be thinking hard in order to move things into long-term memory, and they need to be thinking for themselves. So for instance, my lesson might well end with this, which is the example that we've already looked at, and all of the things there. We've taught the lesson before it, we've done some modelling, we've got some scaffolding for Jimmy, but actually then this is going to be 10 minutes working completely on our own, working in silence, where we're going to try and take on that task and do those things, because we know that that's how we learn. We know that we need to be thinking hard to be able to do that. But it does also have some other purposes, which I'll talk a little bit about now. When we've talked to the students about this, particularly in assembly, we've kind of solved it with these. So the first question I would have, and I think it's an interesting question for us all to think about, is this: do we think that this boy's dad demonstrated how to ride a bike and gave him a few tips, and then all of a sudden he could just ride a bike? And from all of our experiences of learning, we know that that can't have been the case. Learning just doesn't happen like that. It's not that simple. There have to be some mistakes, and there has to be some real effort to improve from those mistakes and get things right. Second question is, I'm going to be teaching my little girl about how to ride a bike, and I'm always going to be wanting to be holding on like that. That's not me in that picture. It's just somebody, but could be me. I'm always going to want to be holding on because I won't want it to fall off. But actually, the second question is, if I was always holding on and I didn't let go, would I actually be doing her any favors in terms of learning to ride a bike? And again, I think we'd all agree that I wouldn't be, because you never learn to ride a bike. Because if people continue to support us and stop us from being independent, we never actually learn to do anything independently. And we need to learn to do things independently if we're going to learn to do them, because we want to do those meaningful things. And the message is really clear that if we don't learn to do important things on our own, if people never stop helping us. If as soon as we start to struggle, someone steps in and helps us with that bit, actually we don't get that hard thinking and we don't get to do it. And equally, if we give up when we don't get that help, then again, we're not going to learn very much, and we're not going to learn to do those meaningful things. Those things have to come with mistakes, but they have to come with independence, which is what for us, over to me, within our lessons is really all about. That's absolutely not about us throwing students in at the deep end and watching them struggle. But what it is absolutely about is making sure that we're giving our students the opportunity to practice tough tasks and to do them on their own after they've been taught really clearly how to do it. This is a really nice diagram for understanding that. We'll show them really clearly, we'll do a bit together, we'll try and make sure that we're as competent and as confident as we can be, and then we'll apply it to the over to me and make sure that we're doing that independent learning on our own. There's a few reasons for that, which I'll talk about. The first is the one I've already talked about. For learning to happen, we need to be thinking hard on our own, at least some of the time within our lessons. Our students can't do that if the teacher is helping every time there's a little bit of struggle there. That said, if somebody is really struggling and over to me, we'll always try and intervene with the minimum amount of support that we think that person needs to then get on with it. Second, we want to build student resilience. We know that student resilience doesn't come from being told how good we are necessarily. Student resilience, all of our resilience, comes from doing difficult things and succeeding. And when we take on challenge, when we do difficult things and we succeed, it shows us about ourselves that when we try, we can be successful. And that obviously builds our self-esteem, it builds our resilience, and we're much more able then to take on challenges as we go forward. We want that for all of our students. Third on there is a really important one. Absolutely, schooling is not entirely about exams, but we know that in year 11 or in year 13, if we come to that, our students are going to be sitting in front of difficult problems on their own with just a pen. They're going to be sitting in silence, and they're going to have to be able to do those things. And we want to give our students opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to get used to doing that, to get used to being in that environment where actually I've got to take on something tough on my own in quiet conditions, and that we're really used to that by the time we get to year 11, so that not only are we more successful at it, but also we can manage our well-being a little bit better through that time period, because there's hopefully less anxiety and less stress attached to it as well. Finally on there, we want to give our students the chance to work without distractions. Over to me's are always done in silent conditions. In terms of minimizing pressure on our working memories, getting rid of those distractions, we know that often that is the best way to work, particularly when we're working independently. There's lots and lots of room for discussion with our lessons. It's really important that students share ideas and talk about their ideas, but actually when we come to apply that independently, it's really important that we've got the environment to be able to do that. So I've gone through the first three there, and then I'll come to 4. And again, this is an interesting one, because once we've moved those things into long-term memory, we would hope that they'd just be there forever and we'd be able to access them. But unfortunately, learning doesn't necessarily work like that. We talked about our goal, moving things from working memory to long-term memory and then being able to access them. Unfortunately, as this graph shows, this is a forgetting curve. Actually, if I just teach somebody something once and they've thought about it once, over time, this is how much they would tend to forget. However, if they start to retrieve that for themselves, so if they start to pull it down from their own long-term memory into their working memory by remembering it for themselves, after each repeat, we retain more and more information. Now I'll try and prove that to you just with a few questions. My first questions are these. Think about your first kiss, who, where, when, or your first day at school, or the first day you met your best friend. The second question I would ask is this. What did you have for tea last Wednesday? And by that, I don't mean last night, I mean the Wednesday before. Now, unless you had a spectacular tea last Wednesday, I would expect your answers to look something like that. And there's a clear reason for that. And it's because of this. So for the first question, or the second question, or the third question, there's a very good chance that actually we went away from that and thought about it the next hour, the next day, the next week, the next month. And over time, because we pulled that memory down from our long-term memory again and again and again and again, actually for ourselves, thinking for ourselves, we retained it in the long term. We remember the things that we think about repeatedly, and essentially we get much better at finding those memories every single time we go back to them. However, you didn't go away from your tea last Wednesday and think about it the next hour, the next day, the next week. And therefore that's just, even though that's something that happened more recently, it's just not something that you end up remembering. For us, we've simplified this, and it's quite a nice simple way of thinking about it. We would love our students to be like this pan over here. We would love to be able to fill them up with knowledge and skills, and for them to just fill up and keep filling up and not leak at all. But that's just not how learning works. We know that actually if we don't come back to things again and again, that does leak and it doesn't end up in long-term memory. We know our students, unfortunately, like all of us, it's how all of our brains work, are much more like colanders. And that if actually we're not very careful, then those things leak. So all of our lessons start with what we call make it stick. Called make it stick because it's things that we do to try and make those things stick in long-term memory. And essentially, that will be questions from either the lesson before or a few lessons before it or even further before that make our students independently remember things for themselves. So a couple of examples here. I might have taught some type of weathering in geography and then say, draw a simple diagram of the following: freeze-thaw weathering, biological weathering, chemical weathering. The students come in and do that independently, and they have to think really hard about what they learned last lesson. They have to think about how each of those different types of weathering work and then be able to construct a diagram on it. And that hard thinking makes them bring those things down from their long-term memory back into their working memory, which really helps them to remember it in the long term. Another example from languages, which is quite a nice one, a point scoring system with grammar with 4 points at the bottom there. Lots of different questions. We're actually trying to achieve a certain number of points within the first 5 minutes of the lesson. When we're retrieving those things and bringing those things down from our long-term memory, we get better and better over time at remembering all of them. So if I just zoom back out to kind of the big picture of our lessons now, this is our learning model. So this is what we want all of our students to experience, and this is broadly what our lessons look like. That's not to say that all of this would fit within a lesson, but it is to say that this is what our cycle of learning would look like across the school. For a student coming into a learning cycle, and we have our make it stick. Now, as I say, that helps us to remember things, but also if we have a make it stick at our start of our lessons, it helps us to lay the foundation for that lesson, because we retrieve knowledge, which then lays the foundations of the new lesson. So we can link in new learning, which we know is absolutely crucial to our students' learning. Second, we then establish the big picture. So what have we been doing? Where have we been? And where are we going? And how does this lesson link within that? Again, that's absolutely crucial to us building memories. For all of our learning to link together, it makes our memories much stronger if we build links across lessons and across the curriculum. Third, we then introduce those chunks of information, as I said, in terms of managing working memory and not overloading our students in small chunks, and link those chunks to prior knowledge by making sure that our students are then thinking about and discussing those chunks of information so that they move into their long-term memory. Once we get towards applying those things to a difficult task, we move into I do, we do. So we do some modelling often. That won't always be the case, because as our students get more confident, they'll need less modelling, less scaffolding. But I do, we do, show our students exactly how to do things, do some things together, build some confidence, and then apply it to a challenging task at the end of the lesson to bring it all together and make sure our students are thinking really hard about what we want them to remember. At the centre of all of that sits our assessment for learning. So there's 3 different tiers to this, 3 different scales. For instance, this first one is about, has everybody got it within my lesson before I move on? I'm not assessing huge amounts there, but what I am seeing is, does everybody actually understand before I move on? And if not, what am I going to do? We've got two key techniques that we like for that. Cold call, which is essentially that we direct our questions to students. If we ask for hands up, generally speaking, we're always going to get an answer from somebody who knows the answer. But as teachers, we need to know who doesn't know the answer. So we direct our questions around to try and go looking for somebody who doesn't necessarily fully understand it. Or if they do fully understand it, then we're ready to move on. Show me boards, again, they're little whiteboards. Lots of our departments use them, not all. And again, that would be about pausing in a lesson and asking some questions and asking students to show the answers on the whiteboards to make sure that we're all happy before we move on. Second on there, we've got our hits. Effectively, they are when we've covered a body of knowledge and skills that we think that students can then apply to show their understanding. We ask them to do a more weighty piece of work, showing their knowledge and understanding on that piece of work. That's not to put a grade on it and not to kind of assess where they are and put and attach grades. What that's all about is seeing whether our students have been able to take on that bigger body of information or take on those skills, how much they've perfected those skills, and then feedback to students so that every student then has some feedback which they can then improve on. And our cycle works that we will give that feedback and then students will respond to that feedback in red pen so that they actually action the feedback and pull that feedback forward. Last on there, we have our iterative assessments. Effectively, that's a much bigger test and they sit before each data collection and they look to assess not just what's just been taught, so what I would call the hot knowledge and skills, the things that we should be quite warmed up on, but also the colder knowledge which we've actually come away from for a period of time. So it's assessing things over a much longer span to make sure that not only did our students learn it when they were actually taught it, but actually they've retained it over time because our make it stick and our retrieval has worked so that they know those things and that they can do those things that we want them to be able to do. And if not, we fill those gaps. That there, the iterative assessment is then what would be pulled through into the reports of progress that you get. So from those iterative tests, that then will come through in reports as to whether somebody is emerging, developing, secure, or excelling within the reports that you achieve at home. Equally, if we're talking about year 10 and 11, those iterative assessments would inform the progress grades that you're getting at GCSE level. So to sum up then, back to this model, we're in the business and what we want to do is change long-term memory. That's what we're all here for. There's 4 barriers that we can work around, and we work around this model a lot. Making sure that our students are paying attention, not overwhelming working memory, making sure that our students are thinking so that they can remember things, and making sure that our students are retrieving things regularly so that we remember the things in long term as we want them to do. I'm not convinced that my questioning function is working because there are no questions over here on this sidebar. However, if you do have any questions that you want, please do get in contact with the school and I'll get